In the second week of February 1945, in a stone-walled command post on the western edge of the Saar, General George S. Patton stands over a folding map table in the wool greatcoat he has worn for 3 weeks straight. The brazier in the corner is throwing more smoke than heat. A field telephone on the side trestle is open on a line to 12th Army Group. A cup of black coffee, poured an hour earlier and gone cold, sits on the corner of the map. The commander of the 3rd United States Army has not slept more than 4 hours in 8 nights, and the cable in his hand is asking him a question for which the Allied agreement signed at Yalta the week before has no honest answer. The cable is from a forward intelligence officer in liaison with the Polish underground. It carries the names of 73 American airmen, taken prisoner by the Germans in 1943 and 1944, recently liberated by advancing Red Army units near Lublin. Under the agreement signed at Yalta on February 11th, those men were to be moved into American custody at the earliest opportunity, fed, deloused, and shipped home through Odessa. They have not been moved. Soviet rear area commanders have refused American liaison officers permission to cross east of the Oder. The 73 names are somewhere in Soviet custody, in a country no American officer is permitted to enter. This was not a routine logistical matter. This was not a wartime accident. This was not a temporary hold for security screening. This was a deliberate refusal by a wartime ally to honor an agreement signed 8 days earlier by the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the leader of the Soviet Union on the disposition of soldiers who had spent 2 years in Nazi camps and were now being treated as bargaining chips in a war that was supposed to be ending. Within 60 days, Patton would order an unauthorized armored raid 250 kilometers behind enemy lines to liberate American prisoners from Stalag XIII at Hammelburg. The Soviet Union would close every American liaison mission east of Berlin, and the cable on the map table that morning would become the first documented evidence in American military files that the wartime alliance was already over. This is the story of what George Patton did with the cable, what it cost him in the 7 months that followed, and what the Allied victory narrative has spent 80 years politely declining to mention. If you have ever wondered which warnings, given by men who saw the next war coming before anybody in Washington was ready to hear it, were dismissed as the ravings of soldiers who had simply forgotten how to stop fighting, leave a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from this evening. And if you are the kind of viewer who wants the parts of the 1945 victory story, the official histories quietly trimmed, like this video and subscribe so the next one finds you on time. The brazier kept burning. The cable kept being read. The decision in the room got made anyway. To understand what Patton was about to do with the cable, you have to understand what his army had spent the previous 8 months learning about its own ally that the diplomats in Washington had not yet been forced to write down. The textbooks of the next 40 years would record the wartime alliance as a triumph of cooperation between 3 great powers against a single barbaric enemy, with disagreements quietly resolved in private meetings. Tehran, Yalta, the joint communiques, the photographs of Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin together. 6 paragraphs in most school histories, ending with the phrase Grand Alliance. Inside the field headquarters of the armies that had to live it in practice, almost nobody believed the tidy version anymore. What every senior American field commander quietly understood by the winter of 1945 was that the Soviet Union had been operating since it crossed the pre-war Polish border on rules nobody had agreed to in writing. Soviet rear area officers refused American observers. Soviet officers shot Polish underground fighters who had aided Western air operations. Soviet quartermasters routed Lend-Lease equipment for purposes nobody in Washington had approved. The unspoken doctrine east of the Oder was simple. The Red Army would liberate, and the Red Army would decide who came back. The American chain of command, meanwhile, had been instructed by the State Department, the Joint Chiefs, and the President himself to preserve Allied unity at almost any short-term cost. Roosevelt was a dying man trying to write a post-war order he would not live to see. The men in the field were told that nothing was to be done that might give the Soviet leadership grounds to suspect Western bad faith. The doctrine was not toughness. It was diplomatic patience. And politically, the case for patience was not invented by frightened men. The war was not over. The atomic bomb was untested. The Pacific War required Soviet entry, and Soviet entry depended on continued goodwill in Europe. Every senior planner in Washington had reasons to swallow Soviet behavior they would have considered intolerable from any other ally. But the men in the forward headquarters had stopped swallowing. Patton was not the only American commander keeping a private log of Soviet incidents. He was simply the loudest. He had been on a political leash since Sicily, brought back into the field in 1944 on the explicit condition that he not become a political problem for the Supreme Commander. By the morning of the cable, the situation in Patton's command post had stopped being a question about 73 airmen. It was something else entirely. The first signal that the Soviet refusal was deliberate arrived through a junior officer who had been told something he was not supposed to repeat. A liaison captain attached to the American military mission in Moscow had cabled a colleague at 12th Army Group that General Dean had been formally refused permission to send observer teams forward of the Oder under any conditions. The refusal had been delivered in writing and signed by a Soviet general officer. The cable had not gone up the chain. It had moved sideways, the way bad news moves in armies that suspect their own headquarters. By the afternoon, Patton had assembled the 4 men whose judgment he trusted: his chief of staff Hobart Gay, his G2 Oscar Koch, his political advisor, and a colonel from 12th Army Group who had spent the previous month trying to extract prisoner status reports through Soviet channels. The colonel had returned with nothing. The files agreed. The Joint Chiefs in Washington were not ready to hear what the files were saying. The State Department was politically forbidden from saying it openly. Eisenhower at Supreme Headquarters was under explicit instruction to preserve Allied unity through the final weeks of the German War. The political envelope, in February 1945, did not include accusing the Soviet Union of holding American prisoners. The other side of Patton's room pressed in the opposite direction. Koch argued that the 73 names were the visible part of a much larger problem. American prisoners liberated in eastern Poland were not being processed. Allied prisoners of every nationality were being held in Soviet collection camps under conditions Soviet authorities refused to allow Western officers to verify. The men in Patton's office were no longer arguing about a temporary delay. They were arguing about a deliberate policy of using Western prisoners as leverage. Both paths were poison. If Patton went up the chain, the cable would be filed, a polite note would go to Moscow, and the 73 men would, at best, surface in Odessa 6 months later, after a war that would by then be over. If he broke the political envelope and confronted the Soviet command directly, he would within 48 hours be summoned by Eisenhower and almost certainly removed from his command for the second time in 2 years. If he did nothing, the 73 men would disappear into a Soviet bureaucracy no Western officer was permitted to inspect, and longer lists would arrive until the names stopped coming. There was no clean outcome. There was only a choice of bills. The clock ran against him in 2 registers at once. Operationally, the German army was within 90 days of complete collapse, and once the collapse came, the contact line between American and Soviet forces would freeze, and no American officer would have any pretext for crossing it. Politically, Patton himself was within 7 months of losing his command for an entirely different reason: a press interview about denazification he had not yet given. Whatever decision he made about the cable, he would have to make it in a window measured in weeks. He read the cable a 3rd time. He laid it face down on the map table next to the cold coffee. He pulled a fresh cigar from the case in his greatcoat and rolled it between his fingers without lighting it. He walked to the small mullioned window at the end of the command post and stood looking out at the courtyard where the jeeps were parked under camouflage netting. Snow was falling on the canvas. A driver was working a wrench on a frozen carburetor with bare fingers. Patton watched the driver for a long minute. He did not light the cigar. He muttered, to no one in particular, a phrase from his diary he had used twice before in the last month, about a soldier who lets his own men be taken twice, losing the right to call himself a soldier at all. The corporal at the door of the command post would later say he heard the general say, very softly, the word no twice. A near miss had already passed unseen. A 12th Army Group staff officer, working through normal channels on February 12, had begun drafting a routine acknowledgement to Moscow, accepting the Soviet position that liberated American prisoners would be repatriated through Odessa on Soviet schedules and Soviet trains. The acknowledgement was within 40 minutes of being signed when a major from Patton's headquarters in 12th Army Group on an unrelated errand recognized the document on a clerk's desk and pulled it from the out tray. Had it gone in, the United States would have formally conceded. 8 days after Yalta, the Soviet right to control repatriation for every American prisoner east of the Oder. He was told about the document at midnight. He thanked the major in 2 sentences. He said nothing else. He understood that the bureaucracy of his own army, left alone, would either save him from the decision or make the decision for him, and that he no longer had time for either option. The decision could no longer be deferred. On the night of February 13, in a candlelit side room off his command post, Patton made the call. There was no signed operations order. There was no cable to 12th Army Group. There was no notification of the Supreme Commander. He gave the order in a single conversation with Hobart Gay, his chief of staff, that lasted under 5 minutes. The conversation had no formal subject line and would not be entered in the war diary in any form a censor would later flag. Gay had served with Patton on 2 continents and understood the form of the general's decisions before he had to spell them out. Patton laid out the choices one final time. The official channel, through 12th Army Group, which would file the cable, generate a State Department note, and produce no recovered American prisoners inside any actionable window. A formal protest through the military mission in Moscow, which had already been refused. The option he intended to take, which was to push armored reconnaissance teams forward of the agreed contact line under cover of pursuit, send American officers in jeeps into Soviet rear areas under flags he would not bother to authorize, and recover, by direct action, every American prisoner whose name reached his command post in the time he had left. When he spoke, he said it in 2 short soldiers' sentences. He did not embellish. These men are Americans. They come home. That was the spine of the decision, and Gay understood it before Patton had to elaborate. The implicit terms were these. The political envelope from Washington would be ignored where it interfered with the recovery of American soldiers. The Yalta Agreement would be honored on the American side and treated as void where the Soviet side had already chosen to break it. American officers, if challenged, would say they were chasing German stragglers. The truth would be carried in their saddlebags. The cost, when the disavowal came, would be paid by Patton. It was not a written order. It was not a numbered field directive. It was a verbal instruction from a commanding general to his chief of staff in a candlelit room. Nobody else was permitted to enter. Gay took the order in silence. He did not pause. He left the room within 90 seconds, woke a major and 2 captains in adjoining quarters, and had the first reconnaissance teams across the contact line before sunrise. The cable from the liaison officer in Lublin sat unanswered on Patton's map table for the rest of the week. In Moscow, General Dean learned of the field movement 6 days later, in a complaint delivered through diplomatic channels, and chose, on his own authority, not to report the complaint to Washington for another 4 days. Patton, by then, was alone at the small window of the command post. He had set the unlit cigar on the windowsill. He had sent Gay back to his work. He had walked to the casement and laid his palm flat against the cold, leaded glass. The courtyard was empty now. The driver had gone in for the night. A single sentry was visible at the gate, breathing steam into the dark. Patton stood there long enough to watch the snow change direction twice before turning back into the room. He thought, in those slow minutes, of his father at home in California. He thought of his son-in-law, who was at that moment a prisoner of the Germans in a camp called Stalag 13 somewhere in Bavaria. He thought of the names on the cable. He did not let himself think about the names on the cable for long. By morning, the order was already moving down the chain. 2 reconnaissance jeeps were east of the contact line. A liaison major was riding north toward Frankfurt with a sealed envelope. A Polish underground courier, paid in cigarettes and canned milk, was carrying a duplicate list back through the Carpathians toward a Red Army camp where some of the names were believed still alive. The liaison officer at 12th Army Group, who had been on the verge of filing the cable through normal channels, took the morning call from his counterpart and listened in silence. He did not speak for almost a minute. Then he asked, with the kind of professional reserve that breaks if you push it further, whether the general intended this on the record. A general had given the order. In the 72 hours after the order moved, no one at 3rd Army headquarters spoke openly of it. The first prisoners came back across the contact line on February 17 in 2s and 3s, on jeeps that had no business being where they had been. By the end of the month, Patton's collection points had processed more than 200 American servicemen whose papers showed Soviet collection camps as their last documented location. By March, the Soviet command had filed 3 formal protests, the State Department had filed 2 restrained replies, and Eisenhower had received from Marshall a 1-paragraph cable advising him to keep Patton on a shorter leash. The fingerprints on the original instruction were nowhere on paper. The papers reported the advance into Germany. They reported the link-up at the Elbe. They reported the surrender at Reims. Buried inside the chronology, almost nowhere, was the fact that an American field army had spent the last 90 days of the war quietly recovering American prisoners from a wartime ally that had no intention of returning them. The 2 short sentences spoken on the night of February 13 would not appear in any official history for a generation. The War Department file would not be declassified until 1981. Patton himself, in the diary entries of those weeks, wrote around the cable rather than through it. The story the public read at the time was the story of a grand alliance closing in on Berlin from 2 sides. The story the public did not read was the order given on a candlelit map table in February that had set the recovery operations in motion in the first place. The world saw the photographs at the Elbe. The world did not see the names on the cable. Patton did not celebrate. He did not write a press release. He did not give an interview about the recovery. He gave one short statement at a 3rd Army briefing in March, in which he advised junior officers to remember which uniform they wore and which uniform their prisoners wore, and he did not mention the Soviet Union by name. By the time the war in Europe ended, his political position was deteriorating in ways he would not survive. By September, the Bad Tolz interview would cost him 3rd Army. By December, he was dead in Heidelberg from injuries sustained in a road accident. The personal cost was severe and largely private. He had broken open, in his own command, a doctrine of Allied unity the President had spent 2 years holding together. He had paid the political price without ever being permitted to explain it. He had given the post-war American military a doctrine of suspicion towards Soviet behavior that would outlast every other element of his career. He never wrote about the cable in detail. He referenced it once in a letter to his wife in March 1945, and never again. The shadow of the winter of 1918, when American soldiers had been left in Archangel and Murmansk by an Allied intervention that no one in Washington had wanted to remember, was not an abstraction in Patton's command post that February. He had been a young officer in France that winter. He had read every dispatch about the polar bear expedition that crossed the desk of his old superior Pershing. He remembered the names of the men who had not come home. The loop, in its way, had begun closing the moment the 73 names reached his map table. What looked, in the candlelight of a stone-walled command post, like the late-night decision of a tired field general, had reshaped the post-war American military relationship with the Soviet Union by spring. Operation Eclipse, as the Allied occupation plan was called, would carry the marks of the recovery into every post-war agreement on prisoner repatriation and contact line procedure. The American military doctrine that emerged in the next 3 years of treating Soviet rear areas as hostile by default and Soviet diplomatic assurances as provisional traced its origin to the cable in Patton's hand. The deepening would outlast every American president from Truman to Reagan. History records the speeches Patton gave. History records the helmet, the ivory-handled revolvers, the press photographs at the bridge over the Rhine. What history does not mostly record is the cold cup of coffee left untouched on a map table in the Saar, while a tired general, alone in a wool greatcoat, gave an order that would feed 73 American servicemen back across a contact line their own government had not yet found the courage to defend. If you had been George Patton in February 1945, with a cable naming 73 American airmen in Soviet hands, an Allied agreement signed 8 days earlier already being broken, a war not yet won, and a supreme commander under orders to give the Soviet Union no pretext for accusation, what would you have done? Would you have filed the cable through normal channels and accepted that the names would surface only after a war by then over? Would you have lodged the formal protest you knew Moscow would refuse? Would you have done what Patton did and recovered the men by direct action? Be honest. Tell us in the comments. And if you want to know what the President of the United States really thought, in private, about the warnings Patton was beginning to give in the last months of the war, the next video on your screen is where the story continues. Thank you for listening.